Before Arthur hung up the phone, he accidentally overheard his daughter-in-law talking to his son, her voice bright and excited. "The old fool signed everything. We're finally getting out of debt." Arthur sat frozen in the kitchen of his Boston home, the phone pressed to his ear as his own flesh and blood discussed a betrayal that made his blood run cold. They didn't know the retired auditor was still listening. They didn't know the line was still connected. And that single miscalculation would cost them everything. The screen of his smartphone finally went dark, severing the audio feed of his own destruction. Silence rushed back into the kitchen, heavy and suffocating like a thick wool blanket. For a long, agonizing moment, Arthur could not draw a breath. His chest tightened with a physical agony that rivaled a heart attack. He lowered the phone slowly, his hands trembling so violently that the device nearly slipped from his grasp. This was not a faceless corporate executive plotting against him. This was David. His own boy. The child he had taught to ride a bicycle on these very streets. The boy who used to sit high on his shoulders at Fenway Park, cheering for the home team until his little voice went completely hoarse. The shadows of the 120-year-old house seemed to close in around him. Every corner of this historic home held a sacred memory of his late wife, Eleanor. She had been the beating heart of their family, the gentle warmth that perfectly balanced his strict, analytical nature. If Eleanor were here today, hearing those words would have killed her instantly. Arthur imagined her kind smile, the tender way she used to stroke David's hair when he was burning with a childhood fever. Now, that same boy was casually discussing locking his father away in a sterile facility just to liquidate a lifetime of hard work and memories. A tear escaped Arthur's eye, hot and intensely bitter, tracing the deep wrinkles of his weathered face. He slumped into the wooden dining chair and allowed himself to weep. For a few uninterrupted minutes, Arthur Pendleton was nothing more than a broken, elderly man grieving the tragic loss of his child to the darkest depths of human greed. But as the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed loudly, something profound shifted within him. The tears abruptly stopped. The trembling in his hands ceased completely. The overwhelming sorrow that had anchored him to the kitchen chair suddenly crystallized into something entirely different, something terrifyingly cold. It was an instinct forged over 40 years in the high-stakes, unforgiving world of corporate fraud investigation. When a forensic auditor discovers a massive discrepancy in the ledger, they do not cry. They do not throw tantrums or demand apologies. They detach. They follow the paper trail. They secure the evidence. They build a case so meticulously airtight that the perpetrators suffocate within it before they even realize they are trapped. Arthur picked up his phone. His thumb moved with precise, deliberate swipes across the glass screen. The automatic call recording software he had utilized for years during intense business negotiations had captured every single syllable of David and Chloe's conversation. He tapped the play button, forcing himself to listen to the file once more to verify the audio quality. Chloe's bright, poisonous voice filled the quiet room again, followed immediately by David's cowardly, compliant agreement. Arthur did not flinch this time. His pulse did not race. He treated their voices not as the sounds of his family, but as raw, actionable data. He immediately uploaded the audio file to 3 separate, highly encrypted cloud servers. He then emailed a backup copy to a secure offline address known only to him. In his long profession, redundancy was the absolute key to survival. Once the upload progress bar reached 100%, Arthur set the phone face down on the cold granite countertop. He walked over to the kitchen sink and splashed freezing water on his face. When he looked up at his reflection in the dark window pane, the grieving, vulnerable father was gone. Staring back at him was the man who had systematically dismantled multi-million-dollar embezzlement rings. The man who could uncover a hidden offshore account from a single, seemingly innocent misplaced decimal point. In his mind, David was no longer his son. David was the primary target of a comprehensive audit. Chloe was the lead co-conspirator. They had made the fatal assumption that Arthur was just a senile, trusting old man ready to be quietly discarded. They had severely underestimated the sheer calculating power of a mind trained specifically to hunt down lies. Chloe had explicitly mentioned Monday morning. Today was Friday night. Arthur mentally mapped out the timeline with ruthless efficiency. He had exactly 72 hours. 72 hours to dissect their scheme from the inside out, gather undeniable, legally binding proof, and construct a trap they could never escape. They wanted to audit his life and declare him bankrupt of his wits. Instead, Arthur was going to audit their souls, and he would not stop until the ledger was entirely, permanently balanced. Arthur left the cold granite counters of the kitchen behind and walked down the long, shadowed hallway toward his study. The hardwood floors beneath his feet, original to the 120-year-old Boston property, creaked softly with each measured step. He did not turn on the main overhead lights. He did not need them. He knew every inch of this house by heart. When he reached the heavy oak door of his study, he pushed it open and stepped into the room that had served as his private sanctuary for decades. The walls were lined with thick volumes of tax code, financial law, and corporate auditing case studies. It was a room dedicated entirely to the pursuit of truth through absolute precision. He moved directly to the large landscape painting of the Boston Harbor hanging on the far wall. Swinging the heavy frame aside, he revealed a steel wall safe. His fingers gripped the cool metal dial, turning it with practiced muscle memory. 4 turns to the right, 3 to the left, 2 to the right. The internal locking mechanism clicked open with a heavy, satisfying sound. Arthur reached inside and bypassed the velvet boxes containing Eleanor's jewelry and his own vital records. His hand closed around a simple, unmarked manila folder resting at the very bottom. He carried the folder to his massive mahogany desk and placed it precisely in the center. He reached out and clicked on his brass desk lamp, casting a pool of sharp, unforgiving white light across the polished wood. He sat down in his leather armchair, pulled his reading glasses from his breast pocket, and unfolded the metal frames. Once the glasses rested on the bridge of his nose, the world outside the pool of light ceased to exist. There was only the desk, the light, and the paper. Arthur opened the folder. Inside sat a stack of 6 neatly stapled pages. Just last Tuesday, David had visited for dinner. His son had been overly cheerful, bringing a bottle of expensive red wine and talking enthusiastically about the upcoming baseball season. After dessert, David had casually pulled this very folder from his briefcase. He had smiled that charming, familiar smile and claimed they were standard tax adjustment forms for a family trust account that required Arthur's signature before the quarter ended. David had even pointed to the specific line on the very last page, handing his father a blue ink pen. Arthur had signed it without reading the preceding pages. Why would he? A father does not audit his own son. A father trusts. That trust was the critical vulnerability David had chosen to exploit. Arthur leaned forward, his face inches from the documents. He did not read the legal jargon yet. An auditor knows that words can lie, but the physical composition of a document never does. He started by examining the staple in the top left corner. He ran his thumb gently over the metal prongs on the back of the paper. They were slightly loose, and the puncture holes in the paper were slightly widened, indicating that the staple had been removed and replaced at least once. He carefully pried the staple open with his fingernail and separated the 6 pages, laying them side by side across the surface of his desk. He looked at the final page first. Page 6. There was his signature in blue ink at the bottom. It was undeniably authentic. He recognized the slight tremor in the loop of his capital letter A and the sharp, decisive cross of the letter T. David had indeed secured his genuine signature. But as Arthur's eyes scanned upward, the structural integrity of David's lie began to collapse. Arthur picked up page 1 and held it up to the harsh light of the brass lamp, positioning it directly over page 6. He checked the alignment of the text. The margins on the first page were tighter, off by exactly 2 millimeters compared to the final page. The spacing between the lines of text on the first 5 pages was fractionally denser. He lowered the pages and focused on the typography. The header font on the first page read "Durable Power of Attorney." Arthur stared at the letters. The font was Times New Roman, but the ink density was subtly different. He lifted the pages to his nose, catching the faint, distinct smell of the toner. The first 5 pages had been printed on a different machine, likely a cheaper commercial laser printer, leaving microscopic satellite dots of toner around the edges of the letters. The final page, the one he had actually signed last Tuesday, was printed on a high-quality inkjet machine, the kind David kept in his home office. The mechanism of the fraud was beautifully simple, yet fatally flawed. David had presented a legitimate, harmless tax document for Arthur to sign on page 6. Later, David had removed the staple, discarded the first 5 pages of the tax document, and attached 5 newly printed pages to the front. He had bound them together to create a completely new, devastating legal instrument. Arthur finally allowed his eyes to read the actual words on the forged pages. The document granted David full, unmitigated legal authority over Arthur's estate, his bank accounts, his property, and his medical decisions. It was a blank check to steal his entire life. David and Chloe were planning to submit this Frankenstein creation to a judge on Monday morning to prove Arthur was incapable of managing his own affairs, paving the way for a forced guardianship and immediate placement in a nursing home. Arthur placed the pages back down on the desk in perfect alignment. He did not feel anger at the forgery. Anger was an unpredictable emotion that clouded judgment. Instead, he felt a deep, resonant sense of professional satisfaction. David had tried to act like a master manipulator, but he had left a glaring, undeniable paper trail. The page-swapping tactic was amateurish, leaving physical evidence that any certified document examiner could destroy in a court of law. This was the very first loophole. The first material weakness in David's grand financial scheme. A fraudulent document is a house built on sand, and Arthur knew exactly how to find the stress points. He picked up his mobile phone from the edge of the desk. The time for gathering internal documents was over. He needed an external investigator to track the money outside these walls. He needed his oldest ally. Arthur dialed a number he had known by heart for over 30 years, preparing to turn his living room into a war room. The line rang twice before a gruff, alert voice broke the silence. Marcus Vance did not sound like a man who had been asleep, even though the antique grandfather clock in the hallway had just struck midnight. During his 3 decades at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically dismantling high-tier financial crime syndicates, Marcus had conditioned himself to be permanently awake. He was the kind of man who slept with one ear listening to the street and one eye fixed on the shadows. Arthur did not waste time with pleasantries. He spoke into the receiver with a voice devoid of any warmth. He needed Marcus at the house immediately. He explicitly stated that they had a major fraud case requiring immediate forensic extraction. Marcus asked no questions. He simply told Arthur to put on a pot of strong black coffee and ended the call. 20 minutes later, a heavy knock echoed through the quiet Boston home. Arthur unbolted the front door to find Marcus standing on the porch. The former agent wore a faded leather jacket over a plain dark shirt, his sharp eyes scanning the empty street before he stepped inside. Marcus had retired from the bureau 5 years ago, but the intense, calculated aura of a federal investigator had never left him. They bypassed the kitchen and moved directly into the formal living room. The space, usually reserved for quiet evenings reading near the fireplace, was instantly transformed into a sterile operational command center. Arthur cleared the large mahogany coffee table of its decorative coasters and stacked magazines. He brought over the brass desk lamp from his study and positioned it to illuminate the center of the table. When Arthur laid the 6 pages of the forged document under the harsh light, Marcus did not offer pity. He did not pat Arthur on the shoulder or offer hollow words of comfort about the betrayal of a son. That was the exact reason Arthur had called him. Marcus understood that in the face of absolute treachery, sentimentality was a fatal distraction. Arthur officially summarized the situation in precise, clinical terms. He detailed the swapped pages, the mismatched toner density, and the margin discrepancies. He then played the audio recording of David and Chloe plotting to liquidate the estate and force him into a nursing facility by Monday morning. Arthur delivered the information like a prosecuting attorney presenting an opening statement. His voice never cracked. His hands never shook. Marcus listened in complete silence, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. When the recording finished, Marcus let out a slow, measured breath. He picked up the first page of the forged document and inspected it closely under the lamp, nodding in agreement with Arthur's forensic assessment. The former agent pulled a heavily encrypted laptop from his leather messenger bag and flipped it open on the coffee table. The screen bathed his weathered face in a pale blue glow. Marcus explained that people do not suddenly attempt to steal $1 million historic property and institutionalize their own father unless there is a catastrophic financial catalyst. If David and Chloe were willing to commit multiple felonies to get their hands on liquid assets, there had to be a massive, bleeding wound in their personal ledger. Marcus cracked his knuckles and began typing. His fingers flew across the keyboard with the speed and precision of a concert pianist. He was accessing secure databases and deep financial networks that officially did not exist. As a former top investigator, Marcus retained backdoors into credit bureaus, corporate filing registries, and offshore banking monitors. He was a digital ghost moving through the global financial system. Arthur stood by the window, watching the silent Boston street outside. He instructed Marcus to look for the invisible liabilities. He told him to bypass the standard checking accounts and look for leveraged assets, shadow loans, and corporate debt shells. David had always been arrogant about his tech startup. Arthur hypothesized that the boy had overextended himself and tried to hide the losses. The living room fell entirely silent except for the rapid clicking of the keyboard and the low hum of the laptop fan. The two veterans worked in perfect synchronization. They were no longer two elderly men in a historic house. They were apex predators of the financial world, hunting a careless amateur who had wandered into their territory. Marcus navigated through layers of corporate obfuscation. He bypassed a series of dummy corporations David had registered in Delaware. He tracked routing numbers and cross-referenced them with local real estate holdings. Every few minutes, Marcus would grunt softly as another piece of the puzzle fell into place on his screen. The digital paper trail was complex, deliberately convoluted to confuse casual observers, but it was hopelessly inadequate against a seasoned federal agent. Arthur poured 2 cups of black coffee, bringing one to Marcus. He knew the results were imminent. The trap David had built for his father was about to be completely reverse-engineered. Marcus stopped typing. He stared at the screen for a long moment, the blue light reflecting in his narrowed eyes. He slowly turned the laptop around so Arthur could see the cascading rows of red numbers dominating the display. The absolute severity of David's secret life was, Marcus did not smile. He pulled up a deeply buried corporate registry. He explained that desperate men do desperate things when their pride is on the line. David had secured a massive, uncollateralized loan from a private equity firm that operated in the murky, unregulated gray area of shadow banking. It was a predatory fund widely known by federal authorities for aggressive collection tactics and ruinous interest rates. Marcus highlighted the bottom line in bold red font. The principal loan, combined with the compounding penalties over the last 6 months, totaled exactly $1.5 million. The staggering figure hung in the quiet living room air. $1.5 million. Arthur walked slowly to his leather armchair and sat down. He steepled his fingers, staring into the dark, unlit fireplace. The entire puzzle was now completely assembled. The motive was no longer a painful mystery. David was not acting out of a sudden, inexplicable hatred for his father. He was acting out of pure, suffocating terror. The shadow lenders were closing in fast. A public bankruptcy would destroy David's carefully crafted reputation, his marriage, and his future. He needed a massive influx of untraceable cash, and he needed it immediately to save his own skin. Arthur's historic Boston home, fully paid off and located in one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the city, was recently appraised at over $3 million. It was the perfect, pristine asset. But as long as Arthur was alive, healthy, and legally competent, David could not touch a single brick of it. The chilling logic of the forged document finally locked into place. David and Chloe could not simply ask Arthur for the money. Admitting to a $1.5 million deficit born from deceit and arrogance would mean facing Arthur's profound disappointment. Furthermore, Arthur would have demanded full control over the restructuring of their lives to fix the mess. David's fragile ego could never handle that level of humiliation. Instead, it was mathematically and emotionally easier to simply erase his father. By declaring Arthur mentally unfit and forcing him into a residential care facility, David would gain total executory control over the estate via the forged power of attorney. He could quickly liquidate the historic house, pay off the shadow fund, clear the credit card debt, and walk away with a comfortable remainder to start over. To David, Arthur was no longer a father. He was simply a highly valuable, highly inconvenient asset standing in the way of financial salvation. Marcus closed the laptop with a soft click. The sudden darkness in the room felt incredibly heavy. He looked at Arthur, his voice low and steady. He told Arthur that the boy was drowning, and he was trying to use his own father as a raft to stay afloat. Arthur did not look away from the fireplace. The grief that had paralyzed him hours earlier in the kitchen was entirely gone, replaced by the sterile, absolute clarity of a senior auditor who has just located the fatal variance in a corrupt ledger. He understood the desperation. He even understood the fear. But understanding a crime does not pardon it. In the rigid world of forensic accounting, a deficit is a deficit, and fraud is a deliberate, malicious choice. David had willingly chosen to sacrifice his father to save himself. Arthur finally turned to Marcus. His voice was like cracked ice. He stated that the motive was confirmed and the financial background was fully documented. The external audit was complete. Now, Arthur noted, it was time to conduct a strict internal inventory of his own perimeter. They needed to secure the physical assets inside the house. The 72-hour countdown was ticking relentlessly closer to dawn, and Arthur had absolutely no intention of allowing a traitor to balance his books with stolen family legacy. The pale light of Saturday morning crept through the tall windows of the Boston home, casting long gray shadows across the living room. Neither Arthur nor Marcus had slept. The empty coffee pot sat on the silver tray, a silent testament to the long night spent dissecting the financial ruin of David and Chloe. The digital blueprint of their betrayal was complete, but Arthur knew that a thorough forensic audit required more than just reviewing electronic bank statements. A true auditor must verify the physical inventory. If David was desperate enough to attempt stealing a $3 million estate, he had likely already begun skimming highly liquid assets from the inside. Arthur left Marcus at the laptop and walked slowly up the grand staircase to the master bedroom. The room had remained largely unchanged since Eleanor passed away 4 years ago. Her favorite perfume bottle still sat perfectly arranged on the antique vanity. Arthur approached her large cherry-wood jewelry armoire. He opened the heavy double doors and began systematically checking the contents against the mental ledger he maintained with absolute precision. The pearl necklaces were present. The diamond earrings were secure. The gold bangles rested exactly where they belonged. Then he reached for the small, velvet-lined drawer at the very bottom. This drawer housed the single most valuable item in the entire house, both financially and sentimentally. It was a vintage platinum Patek Philippe pocket watch manufactured in the 1940s. The timepiece had belonged to Eleanor's grandfather. Eleanor had cherished it deeply, winding it carefully every Sunday morning just to hear the delicate, rhythmic ticking of the intricate gears. Before she died, she had made Arthur promise to keep it safe until Leo graduated from university, intending it to be a monumental gift for their only grandson. Arthur pulled the small drawer open. His breath caught in his throat. The molded velvet depression where the watch had rested for decades was completely empty. He stared at the void for a long time. He did not frantically search the room or tear through other drawers hoping he had misplaced it. An auditor does not misplace a primary asset. He knew exactly what had happened. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a small leather-bound notebook where he kept serial numbers of important household items, and walked back downstairs to the living room. His footsteps were heavy, echoing with a chilling finality. He placed the open notebook on a coffee table next to Marcus's laptop and pointed to a specific string of alphanumeric characters. He told his old friend that a platinum Patek Philippe complication was missing from the master bedroom. He requested a cross-reference through the state pawn shop registries and stolen property databases. Marcus looked up, reading the terrifying stillness in Arthur's eyes. The former federal agent nodded slowly and cracked his knuckles again. He opened a new secure portal, typing the serial number into a centralized database utilized exclusively by law enforcement to track high-value goods across Massachusetts. The search took less than 2 minutes. The screen refreshed, displaying a high-resolution scan of a pawnbroker receipt from a notoriously discreet shop located in the Diamond District of downtown Boston. Arthur leaned over to read the digital document. The date of the transaction was exactly 6 months ago, aligning perfectly with the timeline of David's tech startup collapse. The payout amount listed on the receipt was a pathetic fraction of the watch's true auction value, a clear indication of a desperate man needing immediate cash to make an interest payment to his shadow lenders. But the most damning piece of evidence was situated at the very bottom of the scanned receipt. It was a digital signature. David Pendleton. A vivid, sickening memory washed over Arthur. Exactly 6 months ago, David had come over for a quiet Sunday dinner. He had seemed unusually stressed, blaming it on a difficult software launch. After dinner, David had asked to use the upstairs restroom. Arthur had sat in this very living room, sipping tea, completely unaware that his own son was slipping into the master bedroom to steal a sacred heirloom from his dead mother. Marcus watched Arthur carefully, closing the laptop screen halfway. He offered to make a few calls to the precinct to have the watch seized as stolen evidence, assuring Arthur they could likely recover it before the broker melted it down or sold it overseas. Arthur raised a hand, signaling for silence. He stood up and walked over to the mantel above the fireplace, picking up a framed photograph of Eleanor. In the picture, she was smiling brightly, holding a very young David in her arms. The discovery of the missing watch was the final drop of poison that killed the last remaining ounce of paternal mercy in Arthur's heart. Before this moment, a minuscule, irrational part of his soul had pitted David. He had viewed his son as a weak, foolish boy trapped in a terrifying financial corner, making catastrophic mistakes out of panic. But pawning Eleanor's legacy was not an act of panic. It was an act of profound, unforgivable desecration. David had crossed a sacred boundary. He had traded his mother's memory to buy himself a few more weeks of a lavish, fake lifestyle. The towering wall of emotional attachment that Arthur had maintained for 38 years completely collapsed, leaving behind nothing but the cold, sterile architecture of pure justice. The audit was no longer just about protecting the Boston house or securing his own freedom. It was about exacting a precise, measured retribution. Arthur placed the photograph face down on the mantel. He turned back to Marcus, his posture rigid and his voice carrying the absolute authority of a judge delivering a final verdict. He stated that they would deal with the watch later. Right now, he needed to know if Leo was infected by his parents' greed. Arthur declared that he would test the boy today. If the grandson proved loyal, Arthur would protect him. If not, the entire branch of the family would be systematically severed from the estate. The time for sorrow had officially expired. The era of absolute punishment had begun. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the quiet hallway. Arthur stood in the foyer, taking a slow, measured breath to compose himself. He had instructed Marcus to remain entirely out of sight in the basement, reviewing the financial data on the laptop. The upcoming conversation required complete privacy. It was an interrogation disguised as a family tradition. Arthur opened the door to find his 16-year-old grandson standing on the porch. Leo looked tired. He wore a faded hooded sweatshirt and carried a heavy canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. He had David's dark hair and Chloe's sharp jawline, a physical combination that suddenly made Arthur's stomach tighten. But as the boy looked up, Arthur saw Eleanor's eyes. They were bright, observant, and deeply troubled. Arthur offered a warm, practiced smile, welcoming the boy inside. He led Leo to the sunroom at the back of the historic house, where a beautifully carved wooden chessboard was already set up on a small circular table. Playing chess on Saturday afternoons had been their private ritual since Leo was 10 years old. It was a game of pure logic, cause and effect, and calculated sacrifice, concepts Arthur had always wanted to instill in the next generation. They sat down opposite each other. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting long, geometric shadows across the 64 squares. Arthur played the white pieces. He moved his king pawn forward 2 spaces to open the game. Leo responded with a standard defensive move, sliding his own pawn forward, but his hand was shaking slightly. For the first 15 minutes, the only sounds in the room were the soft click of weighted wooden pieces sliding across the board and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Arthur played methodically, observing his grandson with the intense scrutiny of a forensic auditor searching for a discrepancy in a suspect interview. Leo was incredibly distracted. He missed an obvious tactical trap, sacrificing a bishop for absolutely no strategic gain. His eyes kept darting away from the board, staring blankly at the garden outside. Arthur decided it was time to apply the pressure. He moved a knight, positioning it to threaten Leo's central defense. He kept his voice perfectly casual, almost academic. He noted aloud that the most dangerous position for a king is not when he is exposed to the enemy, but when he is suffocated by his own pieces. Arthur explained that a careless player will build a wall of pawns and rooks around the king, thinking it provides safety. In reality, it only traps the king, leaving him with no avenues of escape when the true threat finally reveals itself from the inside. Leo swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He did not touch his pieces. He kept his eyes fixed on the wooden board. Arthur leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together in his lap. He shifted the conversation away from the abstract rules of the game and directly into the reality of their lives. He mentioned that Chloe had called the house early that morning. Arthur fabricated a lie, stating that Chloe had sounded extremely worried, asking if Arthur had forgotten to lock his front door the previous night. Arthur sighed softly, expertly projecting the vulnerability of an aging man. He asked Leo directly if his mother was right to worry. He asked if Leo thought his grandfather was losing his grip on reality. The question hung in the quiet sunroom like a physical weight. Leo froze completely. He looked up, his eyes wide and panicked. The defensive walls the 16-year-old had tried to build shattered in an instant. His lower lip trembled violently. He tried to speak, to offer a polite reassurance, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, a single tear spilled over his eyelashes, cutting a shining path down his cheek. Arthur did not break eye contact. He waited in absolute silence, letting the immense guilt inside the boy force its way to the surface. Leo suddenly reached down, unzipped the front pocket of his canvas backpack, and pulled out a small, cheap spiral notebook. His hands were shaking so severely that he nearly dropped it. He pushed the notebook across the smooth surface of the chessboard, knocking over 2 pawns in the process. The boy's voice broke into a wretched, heavy sob. He confessed that his mother had given him that notebook 3 weeks ago. Chloe had ordered him to document every single time Arthur repeated a story, every time he misplaced his reading glasses, and every time he paused for too long before answering a question. She had told Leo it was for his grandfather's own health, a necessary medical log to ensure Arthur received the proper care as he aged. But Leo was not a fool. He had inherited his grandfather's sharp, analytical mind. Leo wiped his face with the sleeve of his sweatshirt, his voice rising in a mixture of profound grief and intense anger. He told Arthur that he knew it was a lie. He cried out that his grandfather remembered everything, from the exact date he bought the chessboard to the complex algebraic equations they solved together for Leo's homework. Leo looked directly at Arthur, his face flushed with tears and resentment. He stated that his parents were trying to build a fake medical file. He knew they wanted to lock Arthur away, and they were trying to force their own son to be the primary witness against him. Arthur stared at the cheap spiral notebook resting among the fallen chess pieces. A wave of profound relief washed over him, immediately followed by a surge of white-hot fury directed at David and Chloe. They had not only betrayed him, but they had actively attempted to corrupt the soul of this innocent child. They had weaponized a boy's love for his family, demanding he spy on his grandfather to facilitate a massive financial fraud. Arthur slowly stood up from his chair. He walked around the small circular table and stood beside his grandson. He placed a steady, reassuring hand on Leo's trembling shoulder. The simple physical contact seemed to break the last of the boy's restraint, and Leo buried his face in his hands, weeping uncontrollably for the terrible sins of his parents. Arthur looked down at the dark hair of his grandson. The boy was the absolute final remnant of goodness in David's house. He was the only piece on the board worth saving. Arthur tightened his grip on Leo's shoulder, his voice dropping to a low, commanding whisper. He told the boy that he was incredibly brave for telling the truth. He confirmed Leo's worst fears, stating clearly that his parents were indeed lying and that they were attempting to steal the estate. Arthur promised Leo that he was not going to a nursing home, and he was not going to let David and Chloe destroy their family without a fight. The internal audit of his grandson was complete. The boy had passed the test with absolute integrity. Now, Arthur knew he had the perfect, unsuspected ally stationed directly behind enemy lines. Arthur let his hand rest on Leo's shoulder until the boy's ragged breathing finally began to slow. The sunroom remained quiet, the abandoned chessboard sitting between them as a silent witness to a shattered family. Arthur knew the boy needed comfort, but time was a luxury they simply did not possess. The 72-hour window was rapidly closing. He needed to convert his grieving grandson into a highly functioning operational asset. Arthur stepped away from the table and instructed Leo to wait for a moment. He walked out to the hallway, descended the wooden stairs into the basement, and found Marcus waiting in the dim light of the laptop screen. Arthur gave a single, firm nod. Marcus understood the silent confirmation immediately. The former federal agent reached into his weathered leather bag and extracted a specialized recording device no larger than a standard metallic button. He handed it to Arthur without a single spoken word. Returning to the sunroom, Arthur found Leo wiping his glasses with the hem of his faded hooded sweatshirt. Arthur pulled up his chair and sat extremely close to the boy. He placed the tiny, black metallic disc directly in the center of the chessboard, right next to the fallen white king. Arthur explained exactly what the device was. It was a voice-activated, high-capacity digital audio recorder, originally engineered for undercover federal informants. He told Leo that tracing the digital financial fraud was only half of the comprehensive audit. To secure an absolute, airtight conviction, they needed real-time operational intelligence. They needed to know exactly what David and Chloe were planning to execute on Sunday night and Monday morning, straight from their own mouths. Arthur looked deep into his grandson's eyes. He laid out the absolute reality of the situation, hiding nothing behind a grandfatherly veneer. He stated that if Leo accepted this specific task, he would be acting as a covert internal auditor inside a highly hostile environment. He would be actively gathering evidence against the two people who brought him into the world. Arthur warned Leo that the psychological pressure would be immense. It would require him to look his mother in the eye, smile, and lie to her face while recording her most intimate and devastating betrayals. Arthur gave Leo a clear, guiltless escape route. He told the boy that he could simply walk out the front door, go home, and lock himself in his bedroom until the legal storm passed. Arthur promised he would never judge him for choosing to hide. The burden of justice was incredibly heavy, and 16 years old was far too young to carry the weight of dismantling a family. Leo stared intently at the black disc sitting on the wooden board. The boy thought about the spiral notebook his mother had cruelly forced upon him. He thought about the countless times his father had lied to his face over the past 6 months, pretending everything was fine while secretly plotting to institutionalize his grandfather and steal the entire estate. The tears in Leo's eyes evaporated entirely. They were rapidly replaced by a cold, hardened resolve that perfectly mirrored his grandfather's exact analytical expression. Leo reached out and picked up the recorder. His hand was no longer shaking. Arthur nodded, a profound sense of pride swelling in his chest. He immediately shifted into strict instructional mode. He taught Leo the precise operational protocols of an undercover financial audit. Arthur explicitly commanded Leo not to ask leading questions or provoke angry arguments. An auditor does not create the data, they merely observe and securely capture it. He instructed the boy to slip the device into the breast pocket of his jacket or hide it behind a decorative vase in the kitchen when his parents were drinking wine and discussing their timeline. Once a damning conversation was successfully captured, Leo was to send a blank text message to Arthur as a secure signal. Most importantly, Arthur ordered Leo to strictly maintain his normal daily routine. He must act exactly like the sullen, distracted teenager his parents expected him to be. If Chloe asked about the notebook, Leo was to invent a minor, harmless lie about Arthur misplacing a coffee cup. He had to feed them exactly the narrative they desperately wanted to hear in order to keep them completely unsuspicious. Leo slipped the tiny device into the front pocket of his jeans. He zipped up his canvas backpack and stood up from the table. He looked directly at his grandfather, his jaw set tightly. Leo stated that his parents were attempting to steal a life that did not legally or morally belong to them. He declared that he would rather help the brutal truth come to light than live comfortably inside a massive, destructive lie. Arthur walked Leo to the front door. He watched his grandson walk down the brick path toward the Boston sidewalk. The boy's posture was completely different now. He was no longer carrying the crushing weight of a terrible secret. He was carrying a hidden weapon of absolute truth. Arthur closed the heavy wooden door and locked the deadbolt. The internal checkpoint had been successfully established within enemy territory. It was time to execute the ultimate defensive maneuver and lock down the central physical asset before the financial market opened on Monday. By 8 o'clock on Saturday evening, the historic Boston home was enveloped in the deep, chilling darkness of a coastal autumn. Arthur Pendleton sat waiting in his formal dining room, the crystal chandelier overhead dimmed to a sterile, functional glow. He had spent the last several hours carefully organizing his remaining financial portfolios, preparing his internal ledger for a massive, unprecedented divestiture. A sharp knock at the front door broke the quiet. Marcus Vance stepped into the foyer, followed closely by a tall, impeccably dressed man carrying a thick, combination-locked leather briefcase. Marcus introduced the newcomer as Elias Thorne, a senior partner at a prestigious downtown law firm specializing in high-net-worth asset protection. Elias was not a litigator who argued loudly in courtrooms. He was a legal architect who built impenetrable financial fortresses. The three men gathered around a long mahogany dining table. Elias unlocked his briefcase and produced a thick stack of legal documents, spreading them out with clinical precision. Arthur did not offer them drinks. This was not a social visit. It was an emergency board meeting to secure a hostile takeover target. Elias looked directly at Arthur and explained the specific legal mechanism they were about to deploy. David and Chloe were operating under the assumption that a forged durable power of attorney would grant them total control over Arthur's estate. To completely neutralize this offensive strategy, Arthur needed to systematically remove the primary asset from his own personal balance sheet. If Arthur technically owned nothing, David could steal nothing. The instrument of choice was an irrevocable living trust. Elias explained that unlike a standard revocable trust, which could be altered or dissolved by the grantor at any time, an irrevocable trust was absolute. Once the ink dried and the documents were filed, the transfer of ownership was permanent and legally binding. The grantor surrendered all rights of ownership to the trust itself. Arthur listened intently, nodding his understanding. In auditing terms, he was about to intentionally bankrupt his own on-paper net worth to protect his operational capital. Elias pointed to the primary beneficiary designation line. The trust was structured to hold the title of the historic Boston property, maintaining Arthur's right to reside there until his passing, but the ultimate, untouchable beneficiary would be his 16-year-old grandson, Leo Pendleton. Should David succeed in declaring his father legally incompetent on Monday morning, the court-appointed guardianship would only apply to Arthur's direct personal assets, which would now consist of little more than a modest checking account and some old clothing. The $3 million house would be entirely shielded, governed solely by the terms of the trust and completely inaccessible to creditors, shadow lenders, or desperate sons. Arthur picked up his reading glasses and a heavy gold fountain pen. For the next 4 hours, the dining room remained absolutely silent except for the crisp rustle of high-quality legal paper and the scratching of the pen. Unlike the fatal mistake he had made the previous week with his son, Arthur read every single syllable of the trust documents. His eyes tracked every clause, every contingency, and every liability limitation. He analyzed the legal syntax with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to corporate tax filings. He signed his name 27 separate times. With each signature, he felt a profound sense of tactical satisfaction. He was systematically cutting the structural supports out from under David's grand financial scheme. David had built his entire strategy on the assumption that the house would be a liquid asset ready for immediate sale. Arthur was currently turning that asset into vapor. It was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning when Elias stamped the final page with his notary seal. The lawyer gathered the massive stack of documents and returned them to his leather briefcase. Elias assured Arthur that he would submit the electronic filings to the county registry database the second the digital portals opened early Sunday morning. Before the weekend was officially over, the title transfer would be an irreversible matter of public record. Marcus walked the lawyer out, leaving Arthur entirely alone in the grand dining room. Arthur stood up and looked around at the antique wainscoting, the original hardwood floors, and the towering bookshelves. He had purchased this home with Eleanor nearly 4 decades ago. They had poured their life savings, their sweat, and their love into these walls. Legally, as of this precise moment, Arthur Pendleton was a pauper. He no longer owned the roof over his head. Yet, as he turned off the chandelier and walked upstairs to get a few hours of sleep, he had never felt more powerful or secure. The core asset was locked in an impenetrable vault. The foundation of his son's malicious plan had been quietly, efficiently annihilated. Now, all Arthur had to do was prepare for the final inspection when the perpetrators walked directly into his fully balanced trap. Sunday afternoon arrived with a heavy gray overcast, matching the sterile, clinical atmosphere Arthur was preparing to cultivate within his home. At exactly 1 o'clock, his encrypted burner phone vibrated with a secure text message from Leo. The internal auditor was reporting in from the field. The message confirmed that Chloe was currently driving over with a man she called Dr. Croft to conduct a final cognitive evaluation. This was the required medical documentation they desperately needed to file the emergency guardianship petition when the courthouse opened on Monday morning. Arthur retreated to his master bedroom to construct his disguise. For a senior auditor who had spent his entire career demanding absolute precision and immaculate presentation, dressing like a man whose mind was unraveling was a highly calculated exercise in psychological degradation. He selected a faded, slightly wrinkled dress shirt from the very back of his closet. He deliberately misaligned the buttons, fastening the 3rd buttonhole to the 4th button, leaving one side of the collar hanging unevenly. He put on a pair of loose trousers and neglected to fasten the leather belt properly. Finally, he ran his hands through his usually immaculate silver hair, pushing it entirely out of place and allowing a few unruly strands to stand up wildly. When he looked in the tall mirror, Arthur did not see himself. He saw the exact fictional character his daughter-in-law had meticulously scripted in her grand financial narrative. He saw a vulnerable, confused elderly man. He saw an easy mark perfectly ripe for liquidation. Arthur practiced a slow, shuffling gait, dragging his left foot fractionally across the hardwood floor to simulate neurological decline. He allowed his sharp, piercing gaze to dull into a vacant, wandering stare. In the world of corporate fraud, corrupt executives often played dumb to avoid federal scrutiny. Arthur was reverse engineering the tactic, playing dumb to guarantee his enemies walked directly into a federal prison. At precisely 2 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. Arthur took a deep, steadying breath, fully embracing his undercover role. He shuffled down the grand staircase, his hand gripping the wooden banister with exaggerated, trembling frailty. When he finally opened the heavy front door, Chloe stood on the porch with an expression of deeply fabricated concern perfectly plastered across her face. Beside her stood Dr. Harrison Croft. Croft looked exactly like a man who routinely sold his medical ethics to the highest bidder. He wore a tailored suit that was far too expensive for a standard suburban psychiatrist, and his overly white smile did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He carried a sleek leather clipboard, an instrument he was about to use to officially declare Arthur legally incompetent while his heart was still beating. Chloe spoke in a loud, agonizingly slow voice, the specific patronizing tone adults reserve for speaking to a slow child. She asked Arthur how he was feeling and introduced Dr. Croft as a nice friend who just wanted to ask a few simple questions about his daily routine. Arthur blinked owlishly, letting his mouth hang open slightly. He muttered a disjointed, mumbling greeting, intentionally calling the doctor by the name of his former mail carrier. Chloe gently led them into the formal living room. Arthur sat down heavily in his favorite armchair, letting his shoulders slump forward in an attitude of complete defeat. Croft sat opposite him on the sofa, clicking his expensive gold pen. The fraudulent psychiatric audit commenced. Croft leaned forward and asked Arthur to state the current day of the week. Arthur paused, letting his eyes wander aimlessly toward the intricate plaster molding on the ceiling. He furrowed his brow in a masterclass performance of feigned, desperate concentration. After a long, agonizing silence, he confidently declared it was Thursday. Croft did not correct him. The corrupt doctor simply made a swift, highly satisfying checkmark on his medical evaluation form. Next, Croft asked him to name the current president of the United States. Arthur offered the name of a political administration from over 20 years ago. He then voluntarily added a completely fabricated, rambling story about forgetting where he placed his car keys that morning, conveniently omitting the fact that he had not driven a vehicle since Eleanor passed away. Arthur delivered every incorrect answer with the earnest, fearful expression of a man terrified of his own failing mind. Throughout the entire charade, Arthur maintained strict peripheral observation. He watched Chloe sitting near the doorway. Her hands were clasped in her lap in a posture of mock anxiety, but Arthur could clearly see the malicious, triumphant gleam dancing in her eyes. She was watching her grand scheme perfectly materialize. She truly believed she was the master manipulator successfully cornering a helpless, pathetic victim. She had absolutely no idea she was the one locked in a glass observation room, completely surrounded by invisible, high-definition digital tripwires. Croft concluded his deeply compromised evaluation after merely 15 minutes. A legitimate cognitive test required hours of rigorous psychological profiling and specialized testing, but a purchase diagnosis required only the bare minimum of plausible interaction to satisfy a busy probate judge. Croft stood up and snapped his clipboard shut with a definitive click. He looked at Chloe and offered a grave, sympathetic nod. He stated aloud that the cognitive decline was severe, advanced, and that Arthur required immediate, round-the-clock residential care for his own physical safety. Chloe covered her mouth, producing a fake, dramatic sob. She thanked the doctor profusely for his time and expertise. Arthur looked down at his mismatched buttons, fighting a massive internal urge to smile. The medical forgery was no longer just a hypothetical threat. It was a physical, documented reality. The enemy had successfully manufactured their falsified reports and submitted them directly into his trap. The prosecution's ledger was growing infinitely stronger with every single lie they proudly recorded. The theatrical performance was a complete success. Now, all that remained was to document the actual transaction of bribery to seal their collective fate. As Dr. Croft concluded his fabricated assessment, Arthur let his chin drop to his chest. He closed his eyes and slowed his breathing into a deep, rhythmic pattern, simulating the sudden, overwhelming exhaustion typical of advanced cognitive decline. He even added a soft, whistling snore for absolute authenticity. Chloe leaned over him, her cloying perfume thick in the air, and whispered to the doctor that they should step outside to the front porch to discuss the final medical arrangements without disturbing her poor, ailing father-in-law. The heavy wooden front door creaked open and clicked shut. The instant the latch engaged, Arthur opened his eyes. The vacant, confused stare vanished entirely, instantly replaced by the sharp, calculating glare of a seasoned investigator. He did not move from the armchair. He simply reached beneath the embroidered throw pillow resting beside him and retrieved a sleek, black digital tablet. Marcus Vance had not merely investigated the financial ruin of David and Chloe. The former federal agent had spent Saturday evening transforming the historic Boston property into a highly sophisticated surveillance grid. Arthur tapped the screen of the tablet, entering a complex security passcode. The display instantly split into multiple high-definition live video feeds. Arthur focused his attention on the primary camera feed, a wide-angle lens flawlessly concealed within the ornate brass light fixture hanging directly above the front porch. A secondary angle, hidden inside a vintage ceramic planter holding Eleanor's beloved ferns, provided a perfectly clear view of their faces. The audio receiver, embedded discreetly within the wooden doorframe, transmitted their voices with absolute, crystal-clear precision. On the glowing screen, Arthur watched the theatrical performance end abruptly. The moment Chloe believed she was safely isolated on the porch, the mask of the grieving, concerned daughter-in-law completely dissolved. Her posture straightened, and her facial features hardened into an expression of cold, ruthless business. She looked at Dr. Croft not as a medical professional, but as a hired contractor completing a dirty job. The audio feed crackled softly before picking up their hushed voices. Croft adjusted the lapels of his expensive suit and stated that the required legal affidavit declaring Arthur mentally incompetent was fully prepared and ready for submission. However, the doctor smoothly added that he required the agreed-upon compensation before officially transferring the document into her possession. Chloe did not hesitate. She unclasped her designer handbag and reached inside. Arthur watched closely as she withdrew a thick, unmarked white envelope. She held it out but did not immediately release her grip. Her voice was sharp and demanding. She sought absolute verbal confirmation that the psychiatric certificate would withstand any potential scrutiny from the probate judge on Monday morning. She needed a guarantee that the forced guardianship petition would be processed without a single legal delay. Croft offered a patronizing, arrogant smile. He assured her that his medical credentials were mathematically flawless and that the local courts routinely rubber-stamped his emergency evaluations without requesting secondary opinions. He reached out and took the envelope from her hand. Arthur zoomed in on the secondary camera feed. He watched with cold, clinical detachment as the doctor casually flipped open the flap of the envelope. Croft ran his thumb over the thick stack of crisp, newly minted $100 bills. $5,000. It was a paltry, insulting sum to trade for a human being's freedom, yet it was the exact price of David and Chloe's morality. Croft nodded in satisfaction, folded the envelope, and slid it deeply into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. In exchange, the corrupt doctor handed Chloe a sealed manila folder containing the signed declaration of Arthur's mental destruction. They did not shake hands. There was no need for pleasantries among accomplices. Croft turned and walked briskly down the brick pathway toward his luxury sedan parked on the street. Chloe stood alone on the porch for a moment, clutching the manila folder tightly to her chest. A look of profound, victorious relief washed over her face. She had the final piece of the puzzle. The keys to a $3 million estate were now officially within her grasp. She turned around, quietly unlocked the front door, and peered back into the living room. Arthur had already slipped the tablet back beneath the pillow and resumed his simulated slumber, his head resting heavily against the wingback chair. Chloe stared at him for a few seconds, her expression devoid of any pity or remorse. She quietly pulled the doors shut, making sure the lock engaged, and walked away down the street to meet David. The historic house fell utterly silent. Arthur sat up straight, his spine rigid. He retrieved the tablet and carefully saved the encrypted video and audio files to his secure offshore cloud server. He watched the progress bar hit 100%. The forensic audit was now comprehensively complete. Every single discrepancy had been traced. The underlying motive was verified by the shadow loans. The physical theft was proven by the pawn shop receipt. The intent to commit fraud was captured by the hidden microphone. And now, the execution of federal bribery and medical forgery was permanently documented in high-definition video. Arthur stood up and walked to the window, watching the gray clouds gather over Boston. The internal ledger of evidence was perfectly balanced. There was not a single missing line item, not a single unverified claim. David and Chloe had meticulously built their own prison. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, Arthur was going to lock the cell door. Monday morning dawned over Boston with a sharp, biting chill that stripped the last remaining autumn leaves from the oak trees lining the avenue. Inside the historic property, the atmosphere was equally unforgiving. The 72-hour countdown had officially reached absolute zero. Arthur Pendleton did not wear the mismatched, wrinkled shirt from the previous afternoon. The performance of the vulnerable, decaying victim had officially concluded. Today, he prepared for the final board meeting of his life. He opened his cedar closet and selected his finest tailored charcoal suit, the exact garment he used to wear when delivering devastating financial verdicts to corrupt corporate boards. He buttoned the crisp white shirt with perfectly steady hands, tightened the dark silk tie into a flawless Windsor knot, and polished his leather Oxford shoes until they gleamed like dark glass. Every single silver hair on his head was meticulously combed into place. When he looked in the tall mirror, the broken father was nowhere to be found. The senior forensic auditor had fully returned from retirement. He descended the grand staircase with deliberate, heavy footsteps, radiating an aura of absolute, unyielding authority. He walked into the formal living room and positioned his favored leather wingback chair to directly face the entrance. He had spent the early hours of the morning arranging the space to resemble a sterile interrogation room rather than a cozy family gathering area. He had removed the decorative family photographs from the side tables, stripping the room of any warm, emotional anchors. In the exact center of the mahogany coffee table, he placed a thick, heavily bound leather folio. This was his final audit report. It was an instrument of pure destruction. It contained every digital transcript, every printed financial ledger, the irrevocable trust documents, the pawn shop receipt for Eleanor's watch, and the high-definition video stills of the bribery transaction. At precisely 9 o'clock, the distinct metallic scrape of a key sliding into the front door lock echoed through the quiet foyer. Arthur remained seated, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He listened to the heavy door swing open. David and Chloe stepped into the hallway. Their voices were artificially sweet, dripping with the condescending tone reserved for the helpless. David called out to his father, announcing their arrival. He loudly proclaimed that they were there to take him to a wonderful new care facility where he would be completely safe and comfortable. Footsteps approached the formal living room. David entered first, holding a small canvas travel bag he had presumably packed with Arthur's cheapest clothing. Chloe followed closely behind him, clutching her expensive designer handbag, her face twisted into a mask of manufactured sympathy. They stopped dead in their tracks. The canvas travel bag slipped from David's grip, hitting the hardwood floor with a dull thud. Chloe's manufactured smile instantly evaporated, replaced by a look of profound, genuine confusion and rising panic. Arthur did not look like a man ready for an assisted living ward. He looked like a chief executive officer preparing to terminate an entire department. He sat perfectly still, his posture rigid, his piercing eyes locked directly onto his son. The silence in the room stretched to an unbearable tension, heavy with the sudden, terrifying realization that the narrative they had constructed was fundamentally flawed. Arthur finally moved. He stood up slowly, his movements entirely devoid of the frail, shuffling hesitation he had displayed the day before. He bypassed his son and daughter-in-law, walking directly to the heavy oak double doors of the living room. He grasped the brass handles, pulled the doors firmly shut, and engaged the heavy iron deadbolt. The lock snapped into place with a loud, echoing crack that sounded remarkably like a judge's gavel striking a wooden block. He turned around and faced them. The trap was now physically and psychologically sealed. David swallowed hard, taking a hesitant step backward. He stammered, attempting to maintain the illusion just a fraction longer. He asked his father why he was dressed in a formal suit, suggesting that the new doctor simply wanted to do a standard intake interview in comfortable clothing. Arthur did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He spoke with the chilling, absolute clarity of a man who held every single winning card in the deck. He informed David that there would be no intake interview. He stated that there was no appointment, there was no nursing home, and there was absolutely no mental decline. Chloe stepped forward, her voice rising in a desperate, shrill attempt to regain control of the situation. She insisted that Arthur was confused again, reminding him of Dr. Croft's visit the previous afternoon and the medical evaluation that proved he needed immediate, specialized supervision. She tried to reach out and touch his arm, projecting the false warmth that had characterized her entire deception. Arthur pulled his arm away before she could make contact. The gesture was incredibly sharp, a physical manifestation of his utter disgust. He looked directly into her eyes, letting her see the sheer, unadulterated intelligence burning within his gaze. He calmly instructed them both to sit down on the sofa. He warned them that they were about to have a comprehensive review of their recent financial activities, and he strongly advised them to remain completely silent until he had finished presenting his findings. David and Chloe exchanged a panicked, terrified glance. The horrific reality of their situation was finally beginning to dawn on them. The calculated facade they had maintained for 6 months was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. This was not a confused old man suffering from dementia. This was a perfectly executed ambush designed by a master investigator. Slowly, acting exactly like 2 condemned prisoners walking toward the executioner's block, they moved to the velvet sofa and sat down. Arthur walked back to his leather chair and took his seat. He placed his right hand flat on top of the thick leather folio resting on the coffee table. He opened the heavy cover and smoothed the first page of the document stack with a calm, steady hand. The psychological warfare had successfully paralyzed his targets. The time for gathering hidden evidence was completely over. The time for absolute, devastating accountability had finally arrived. Arthur looked down at the open leather folio, his face a mask of impenetrable, forensic calm. He did not yell. He did not launch into a passionate, furious tirade. He began the final audit review by simply recounting the events of Friday evening. He described the missed button on the mobile phone and the open audio line. He reached into the folio, retrieved a small digital remote, and pressed a single button. The hidden Bluetooth speakers in the corners of the living room flared to life. Chloe's bright, excited voice filled the space, declaring that the old fool had signed everything and they were finally getting out of debt. David's cowardly agreement followed immediately. David flinched violently as if he had been struck across the face with a physical weapon. He stared at his father in absolute horror. Arthur turned the page of his ledger. He calmly detailed the exact chronological collapse of David's tech startup 6 months ago. He explicitly named the shadow investment fund, the maxed-out credit limits, and the catastrophic $1.5 million deficit hanging over their heads. David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from his face as he realized his father had systematically dismantled every single layer of his deeply hidden secret life. Arthur then reached into the folio and extracted a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the polished mahogany coffee table. It was the high-resolution scan of the Boston pawn shop receipt. Arthur stared directly into his son's eyes, his voice dropping to a terrifying, icy register. He stated that financial desperation was a pathetic excuse, but trading Eleanor's vintage platinum Patek Philippe watch to service a loan to loan sharks was an absolute, unforgivable sacrilege. The final shred of David's composure shattered. He slipped off the edge of the velvet sofa, his knees hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. He began to weep openly, a pathetic, wretched sound. He clasped his hands together, begging his father to understand the immense pressure, claiming he was terrified of losing everything and that he had planned to buy the watch back. Arthur completely ignored the tears. An auditor does not accept apologies in place of missing funds. He turned to the next page. He pulled out the heavily stamped legal documents from the Lias Thorn. Arthur looked at Chloe, whose face was twisting into a mask of pure panic. He informed her that the grand prize of her malicious scheme was officially gone. He explained the mechanics of the irrevocable trust he had executed on Saturday night. He declared that as of Sunday morning, the historic $3 million property belonged exclusively to Leo. Legally, Arthur owned absolutely nothing for a court-appointed guardian to liquidate. Chloe's eyes widened to the point of madness. The central pillar of her grand, desperate narrative was instantly vaporized. She leaped up from the sofa, her hands curling into fists. She began to scream, her voice shrill and echoing off the antique walls. She accused Arthur of trapping them, of being a cruel, manipulative monster who was trying to destroy his own family. Arthur silenced her frantic screaming by sliding the black digital tablet across the coffee table. He tapped the screen once, the high-definition video feed from the front porch began to play. The screen clearly displayed Chloe handing the white envelope containing $5,000 to Dr. Croft. The audio of the illicit transaction was impeccably crisp, capturing every single word of the bribery negotiation. Chloe froze. Her screaming died instantly in her throat. She stared at the glowing screen, her entire body trembling as she witnessed the undeniable, documented proof of a major federal felony. There was no defense. There was no alternative narrative to spin. The ledger was closed. Before either of the perpetrators could formulate another lie, the heavy oak doors leading to the adjoining library clicked open. Leo stepped out of the shadows and walked into the living room. The 16-year-old boy wore his canvas backpack, his posture rigid and his jaw set tightly. Chloe gasped, reaching out a trembling hand toward him, crying out his name in a desperate plea for an ally. Leo stopped walking and looked down at his parents. There was no love in his eyes, only a profound, sickening disgust. He looked at his father weeping on the floor and his mother trembling in absolute defeat. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room with the lethal precision of a surgical blade. He asked his parents if they truly intended to sell their own family just to buy back a failed software company. He stated that they were disgusting, and he absolutely refused to follow them into their ruin. David buried his face in his hands, letting out a hollow, agonizing wail. Right on cue, the sound of heavy fists pounding on the front door echoed through the foyer. The lock clicked open from the outside. Marcus Vance strode into the house, his federal agent aura fully engaged. Flanking him were 4 uniformed officers of the Boston Police Department, their expressions grim and strictly professional. Marcus led the officers directly into the living room. He did not say a word to David or Chloe. He simply nodded to Arthur, acknowledging that the operation was complete. The officers stepped forward, issuing the standard Miranda warnings in flat, authoritative tones. The metallic, rhythmic clicking of heavy steel handcuffs echoed against the antique walls as the officers securely bound the wrists of David and Chloe. Arthur remained seated in his leather chair. He watched the officers pull his weeping son to his feet. He watched them lead the 2 traitors out of his home, out of his life, and into the waiting police cruisers. Arthur felt no triumph. He felt no joy. He simply felt the cold, sterile closure of a fully balanced equation. The gavel struck the heavy wooden block in the downtown Boston courthouse, its sharp echo finalizing the destruction of a fractured family. Arthur Pendleton stood at the witness stand, his posture as immaculate as his tailored suit. When the judge asked for his victim impact statement, Arthur did not speak of broken hearts or shattered dreams. He spoke with the chilling, absolute clarity of a senior auditor. He looked directly at David and Chloe, who were sitting in their bright orange jumpsuits, and stated that greed is never a simple accounting error that can be easily erased. He declared it a profound moral bankruptcy, a deliberate deficit of the soul that ruins everyone it touches. The judge agreed entirely. David was sentenced to 7 years in a federal penitentiary for grand financial fraud and elder abuse. Chloe received a 5-year sentence for her active conspiracy and participation. Dr. Croft was permanently stripped of his medical license and handed a severe prison term for accepting the bribe and falsifying medical records. The court was adjourned, and the heavy doors closed on that dark chapter of Arthur's life. Several months passed. The harsh Boston winter slowly melted into a quiet, reflective spring. One morning, Arthur found a thin envelope in his mailbox bearing the sterile stamp of a state correctional facility. It was a handwritten letter from David. The pages were stained with tears, filled with desperate apologies and begging for a single chance to make things right after his release. Arthur sat in his study, reading the frantic words of his son. He felt a profound, heavy sorrow, but the cold logic of the auditor remained. He folded the letter precisely and placed it deep inside the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. Forgiveness was a complex transaction, and Arthur simply was not ready to close that specific account. True redemption required time, and time was the only currency they had left. Exactly 1 year after the arrests, Arthur sat in a bright, modern office space overlooking the city. Alongside his old friend Marcus Vance, Arthur officially launched a specialized legal defense fund designed specifically to protect vulnerable senior citizens from financial exploitation. He channeled his massive wealth, his decades of forensic expertise, and his unwavering pursuit of justice into a shield for those who could not protect themselves. He was no longer just an auditor of corporate greed. He had become a guardian of human dignity. Later that afternoon, the golden light of an autumn sunset bathed the backyard of the historic Boston property. Arthur stood near the garden edge, holding a wooden plank steady while Leo hammered a nail into the newly repaired fence. The boy, now 17 years old, had grown taller, his shoulders broader, and his eyes filled with a quiet, resilient strength. He had moved in with Arthur permanently, filling the old house with life, purpose, and genuine love. Arthur watched his grandson carefully align the next wooden board. A deep, settling peace finally washed over his weary soul. The horrific audit of his family was completely over. The universe had taken his son, but it had returned a grandson who embodied absolute integrity. The profound deficit had been fully reconciled. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Arthur smiled, knowing that the ledger of his life was finally, perfectly balanced. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey today. This story serves as a powerful reminder that while family is a precious bond, love must never mean abandoning your personal boundaries. Greed and desperation can drive people to commit unthinkable betrayals, and blind trust can sometimes become our greatest vulnerability. The ultimate lesson here is that true strength lies in protecting what is right, standing up for your own dignity, and knowing that forgiveness is a personal journey that cannot be rushed or forced. We would love to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to draw a difficult line with someone you cared about? Please share your thoughts and relate this narrative to your own real-life experiences in the comments section below. We read every single word and truly want to listen to the feelings coming from the very bottom of your heart. If you found value in this story, please consider subscribing to our channel, liking this video, and sharing it with your friends and family. Your support helps us bring you more captivating, highly emotional stories every single day. We sincerely wish everyone watching this video robust health, a joyful life every single day, and profound, lasting peace. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.